Hello, class. Dr. Iria Abram here. I want to take a moment to go over biblical exegesis. Exegesis. On your course homepage, you have a handout. Um, Looks like this. Biblical exegesis as research. Go ahead and pause this video if you need to print this off or download it onto your device so that you can follow along. I'm going to go into some things, but I want to start by saying every person that you know who teaches or preaches scripture, hopefully, prayerfully, has some method of exegesis. They have some process of pulling the meaning out of scripture. That's what exegesis is. It's how you pull the meaning and the relevance out of a scripture that you're investigating or that you're reading. And so there are more than one ways to go about this process. There are many. So I'm teaching you one very basic, core, fundamental way. This is a great tool that I found some years ago, and I've been teaching from it because it's a great introduction for students. However, everybody has their own way of approaching exegesis because you will add into your process what's important to you. Every person you know, there's a person you may know and you say, oh, I love to hear them preach, or I love to hear them teach, because they have something that they do, that they include, that's extra, that you like hearing. They have a way, a perspective, a voice that you resonate with. And so they may have a process of exegesis that helps them to create that. And that's why you hear it in everything they do. For some people, it may be adding an opening joke. After they investigate the text, one of their final steps may be to add a lead in to kind of bring people into the headspace of what it is they want to talk about. For some people, it's the prophetic. They're always looking for what was prophetic about this. Where did we hear this before? When did God tell us this was going to happen? For me, it's the voice of a woman, or a description that resonates with myself in one of my dimensions. Maybe I'm looking for the voice of a wife or a mother or a business owner, or a preacher, teacher, as a female. So I want to know, where are the women in this story when I read a text? Where's the voice of a woman? And that helps me to uncover more, because I'm searching more to find that perspective, to find that voice. So you too will have your own process of exegesis based on what you want to include and what's important to you to be reflected in your preaching and teaching as your voice. Okay, so very quickly, there are 7 steps here, and I want you to read this. It's mostly a lot of sources listed. Now, I will tell you, these sources are dated. You will see text in here from like 1970s and such. Find the author, Google the author, Google the name of the text, and look for more recent publications they may have. Look for more current books or sources that they may provide that will help you in your exegesis process. So even though these are dated, there are more current, or there's a new volume or a new version that may be available to you. Okay, so step 1 says determine the canonical context. So another word for canonical is just biblical, a good synonym. What's the biblical context? And write this down. In step 1, I want you looking for the author, the date, the location, and the audience. Okay, who's writing it? When are they writing it? Where are they writing it? And who's listening? Who did they write this to? Okay, you'll see sometimes, like in New Testament, Paul is writing different when he's writing to people and new converts as he is when he's dealing with pastors and leaders. It's a different voice there. So you want to know who was intended to hear this, so that you can have an accurate application of that scripture in real time. Okay, all of those steps can be investigated and squeezed to the fullest. When I say squeeze, imagine a sponge full of water, and you're squeezing out as much as you can out of that sponge. You can investigate any points in this exegetical process to the fullest extent that God leads you. Okay, who wrote it? Why did this person write it? Why does it mean something to hear this coming from this person than to hear it coming from someone else? What's the difference if you talk about the Gospels, hearing it come from Luke's perspective than what Matthew had to say about it? So it helps you uncover a lot when you investigate authorship. The date. Certain terms and phrases mean something different depending on when it was written. At one time, saying someone slept together might mean they were in the same nomadic group of travelers and they dwelt in the same cave or the same tent or in the same village. If you say someone slept together now in 2020, that has a whole different connotation. So knowing when something was written helps. Let me plug this in. Get your tools. You want a good concordance, a good study Bible with a good glossary. A good concordance will help you look up phrases based on when it was written. It'll tell you how many times in the Bible it's referred to. There's so many great study tools when you get a good software, and you don't have to spend hundreds and hundreds of dollars on those hard copy books. Now you really can pay for access to a catalog of this information that you can search and use digitally online for a faster study. Okay, so look into your tools. Okay, all of those things. The location. Where was this person when they wrote it? Were they in prison? And what does that have to do with this scripture? How does that add a layer of meaning to this scripture that the person wrote this from a place of bondage? Were they in a valley place? Were they running? Were they hiding? Where a person was when they created or wrote down and penned the scripture, or had the experience that's being penned, right? Because we believe the scriptures inspired. Someone wrote this down, but our Bible was an oral tradition. These were stories that were told over time before we got it to pen and paper, especially Old Testament. So you just want to explore all of those points to the fullest and see what that might mean. Who's the audience, right? What does it mean that this is being said to these people versus, and why wasn't it said to these people? Was it said to believers? Was it said to leaders? Was it said to new converts? Is this a word of rebuke? Is this who is hearing this, and what does that mean? So every element can unearth something for you, okay? And let me say this too. Exegesis is the back work. It's the back office. It's before you get to the pulpit. This is your study and preparation. This is your homework. This is you preparing the sermon. This is you preparing the research so that you can write the sermon, okay? You don't necessarily preach your exegesis. Your exegesis is how you toil and wrestle and seek God about the scripture so you can get the message, okay? Because taking that message and turning it into a sermon is a whole different process, okay? That's homiletics. That's, your preaching style. That's all of those things. But exegesis, it's the study. This is the grunt work, the grind work that happens in your study at your table in the midnight hour. This is you getting in that word and pulling out the meaning. Okay, let's go on to step 2. Step 2 says establish the text. Okay, establish the text. So you want to ask yourself, and I'm going to give you a tool. I have a tool here called Biblical Exegesis Further Explained. Okay, we're going to see this. I will put it in your course homepage. It's a tool I created just to give some bullet points to each of these steps to help people with understanding this. Okay, so step 2, you want to determine the biblical context. That was step 1. Step 2, establish the text. Okay, what was the original language? Is the scripture a part of a larger story or pericope? Right? For example, Psalm 23 and 5 should not be taught in isolation from the rest of Psalm 23. Right? It's a part of a larger saying. So some scriptures might be taken out of context if you don't give the full context. So you hear a lot of teachers sometimes, they have to tell you where this started. Let's go back and look here. And this continues here. This is what happened before we got here. These people came out of a place of hiding. These people came out of a place of persecution. That's how we got to this point. Now, after this is what's going to happen. So they can give context so that the scripture can be taken in context, okay? So you want to establish the text. And then you want to look for terms like for example, John 11:35, Jesus wept. You can't teach it in isolation of the full story of Lazarus, so that a person can understand what does that mean, and why was it significant that Jesus wept, and what happened after, and what does that mean for us. So you want to make sure that you're taking the full understanding of the text, okay? Then step number 3, establish the translation. The translation, okay? In this step, you want to pay attention to vocabulary and grammar, right? So you want to look and say, is this Greek? Is this Hebrew? This is why for graduate religious studies students, biblical languages is so important and required for your master's degree. You are a primary source. You can take that original Hebrew and that original Greek, and you may see something in the way the construct was made that speaks to you. You know, why is this phrase possessive? Why is this feminine? Why was this masculine? Why was this connected to this? You can see some things. Sometimes God will speak to you in the way things were put together. So you want to look at that. And then what keywords pop out at you? What keywords do you hear? For example, and I have an example here. You may hear in a scripture, hill, valley, tree, storm, love, fear. These key words may pop out at you, okay? And you want to pay attention to that. Why were these words used in this scripture? What relevance do they have? Then also, finally, you want to pay attention to the translation and the version of the Bible that you're reading. Message, NIV, King James, New King James, whatever. You want to make sure that you're very clear about what translation you're using and why you're using that translation. Okay, because all of that may have something to do with the key words that you pick up on and how they're transliterated and translated. Okay, so you want to pay attention to that. So step 4 is where you establish the first meaning. You want to establish the first meaning, okay? Study the syntax. Syntax is sentence structure. Syntax is how it's put together. So, like before we said in step 3, a keyword might be trees. So in step 4, when you're looking at syntax, a scripture may say, I see men as trees. So you go, okay, I had some key words, but now I see that was a metaphor. I see that was a way of describing something else. And why was tree used and not, I see men as hills. I see men as giraffes, but I see men as trees. What does that mean? Why is it important that that term was used? Okay, so you want to look at the syntax and how things are put together. Okay, is it a parable? Is it a confession? Is it a sermon? Is it a prayer? Is this a dream? Right? You want to understand what it is you're reading. Where is the scripture coming from? And so that you can interpret it correctly. Okay? The scripture may be a letter of correction in response to quarreling and divisiveness. We see that a lot. So you just want to know what's happening and how did this scripture come to be? Why do I have this piece of scripture here? Okay, remember, we're squeezing that sponge. We're trying to get everything out of it that we can get, because God may speak to you on any one of those points and give you a message or a word. That's why the scripture can be taught over and over again, a year after year, generation after generation, and it never gets old. They call it the talking book, the living book, because there's always something you can relate or something God may speak to and pull out that you didn't pay attention to before. Okay. Step 5, the historical and geographical context. What's unique about where this is taking place, right? And what's happening all around. You want to pay attention to history. Is this an important part of history? Is this Pentecost? Is this the crucifixion? Is this a major event? You want to imagine that you're going into the Bible and you're standing there and this scene is live all around you. What's happening, right? What is the culture like? What's happening among God's people? Are they in persecution? Are they in power? Are they in hiding? Are they moving? Are they migrating? You want to know what's going on historically and geographically, right? Where are they physically? Are they in a high place, in a low place, in a valley place, in a mountaintop? You want to pay attention to the geographical context and the historical context in step 5. Step 6, right? Remember, step 4 was the first meaning, right? You're looking at that, just literal meaning. So what is this saying, right? When you get to step 6, you want to find that theological meaning. This is where the golden nugget is, okay? At this point, you should be able to identify the message or the main point of the text. What would it have meant to the original audience or to the original person that it was directed to, and what is the core principle, right? So by the time you look at who wrote it, when they wrote it, and what was happening around them, and you pull out key words, by the time you've spent that much time with this text, by step 6, you should be able to say, this is what this text meant. This was the purpose. This is the meaning of this scripture. Love, faith, endurance, forgiveness, long suffering, what unity, right? All of these themes, you start to pull them out and to say what the meaning is, because you get to step 7, and that's where you're going to have your practical application for today, right? So now that you've identified the message and the meaning, what does that mean for your reader, your hearer today, to who you're talking to? So if I pull out of the scripture that this is about forgiveness, this scripture, this story is teaching us that we must forgive one another. Now, how do I turn around and make that relevant and applicable to the person I'm speaking to and teaching right now? In what ways do we need to learn how to forgive today? Look at what's happening around us, politically and socially right now. How do we apply forgiveness there? Do we need to forgive ourselves for wrongdoing? Do we need to forgive others for doing us wrong? Sometimes people hold alts in their heart against God. Do you need to technically forgive God, or do you need to move past it somehow? What does forgiveness mean? So you get to unpack that now that you've done all of those things. Now I have a bonus step, I call it an 8th step. It's not on paper and you're not required to refer to it, but it's, beyond practical application for today. My bonus 8th step is, what are the implications for the future? What's at stake if we don't teach this, if we don't preach this, if the next generation doesn't get this lesson? What will be lost? And why is it so important for us to make sure that the 22nd century adopts these principles, understands this message? Why do they need it? That takes it further from me when I'm preaching or teaching or extrapolating a scripture, outside of how it's going to help you right now. But why is this important to get? Why our children are going to need to know this? Why will the kingdom need to understand this in order to survive in the future? So those are the key steps of exegesis. So many of you have emailed or kind of reached out to me to say, I'm really not understanding this exegesis. You just want to break it down. Now, I also included a sample exegesis paper on your course homepage. So look at the exegesis handout, biblical exegesis as research. Okay. Then take the biblical exegesis further explained, and then print off or look at the sample exegesis paper, because I highlighted exactly how they included the points, because it's not just bullet points. Number 1, bing. Number 2, bing. No, an exegetical paper also has narrative writing, so you have to explain and make these points flow in a writing that makes sense. And since it's religious studies, it needs to be in Turabian format. So one of the other videos that you will watch with this course will explain Turabian a little bit. I'll go into it, but mostly there's a video I'll refer you to and a handout of notes that I've made on Turabian. All right, so hopefully this was helpful. If you still have any questions about exegesis, email me and I will be sure to get back to you. Be blessed.